Oh my, I know this real well. Okay. I was teaching at Wilson, I think they were called intermediate or middle schools then. They kept changing the names. There were attempts to have layoffs. There was always a big dropout problem. So I organized this event, and one of the people who spoke was a student of mine. And then next to me is my wife, CJ Prentice, what year, 87? At that time, she began her political career in 1984, winning election to the State Board of Education. She was the only African American and actually got the resolution passed that schools should teach Black history, among other things. I won't go into all her life. Too bad she wasn't here to talk. South High was kind of in the border of the Union Miles area as well as the Fleet area. So it had a small, before desegregation, a small group of Black people. In fact, if she decided to go to the house and didn't go to a private school in New England, Tracy Chapman would have gone to South High School. The union chair said to me, "Mr. Charney, how many do you have in your class this year?" I was a new teacher. And I said, "What do you mean? How many niggers you got in your class?" And what I learned is that among white people, and that was totally outside my experience, and I didn't know what to do as a first-year teacher to how to respond, but the fact that many white people felt so comfortable using the N-word among each other showed me a level of internalized white racism that was so powerful that it reoriented my role in life. Because as I was going to South High, what was going on in Boston, Massachusetts, is that sections of the white community in Boston were rising up against desegregation to the extent that they would, early in the morning, throw rocks at little Black kids coming from Roxbury into Southie. And this was known all around the country, massive racial confrontations. And I asked myself, as a white teacher with a long political history, what can be done to make sure that when desegregation came to Cleveland, and we knew it would come, how do we create an atmosphere of racial cooperation and peace as desegregation took place? Throughout my whole life, including up to today, I'm an education and political strategist, not only an engaged classroom teacher. So I said, the issue of desegregation, it was never called desegregation hardly, it was busing, was so divisive. How could we move this city forward with not being for or against busing? So I invented Welcome. Welcome had certain strategic underpinnings. Welcome stood for West Siders and East Siders, let's come together. I thought the level of white racism was appalling. I thought there was a politically mature Black leadership that did not want at that time to risk anything and be upfront to say, we got to end segregation, despite the fact in 1963, the United Freedom Movement pushed for that and actually led to the, I would call it the murder, but accidental running over of a white, I think he was Unitarian minister, Bruce Clunder, when they were building in the Glenville area. They were trying to stop it and it came over. So the strategy was, let's say that we accept that we won the Brown versus Board of Education decision. We don't have to push for the end of segregation. So our first premise was desegregation is a reality. How do we welcome the kids as the end of segregation took place? So it was a strategic intervention, not to be for or against busing, but to raise a different question. How do we create an atmosphere of racial cooperation and peace as we began. So we created this very Cleveland-esque logo of two hands shaking under a suspension bridge. West Siders and East Siders, let's come together. Interestingly, as my political consciousness got raised, the second year of Welcome, we changed the logo from two hands to three hands. And it was Welcome, Bienvenidos. Bienvenidos means welcome in Spanish. At that time, the school district was in disorganization as the federal judge Battisti was ordering the end of segregation. And they delayed it. We couldn't get the buses. I can't believe that comment. But they brought in a superintendent. His name was Leftwich from Boston. And he was speaking at the City Club. We had just announced we were forming Welcome. And on that elevator, I saw this very well-dressed woman in an afro. And she looked at me, because I guess I was on TV or in the newspaper. Weren't you on TV yesterday? And I introduced myself, and she said, I'm doing something just like it. I set up Black community leaders for peaceful school desegregation. And that is where I met my wife, C.J. Prentice. And we became the co-leaders of Welcome. Eventually, we got married, and we were married for 43 years before she died a year ago. And she had a really illustrious political career. But that's how we met. But if you listen very closely, the name of her organization, which essentially merged with Welcome, was Black Community Leaders for Peaceful School Desegregation. Because it wasn't Black Community Leaders for Desegregation, because there was a real big division between the NAACP, which filed a court case, and the Black political leadership, particularly the head of the school board, Arnold Pinckney, who didn't want desegregation. My analysis is that some, not all, Black political leaders were comfortable in getting elected all the time. So it wasn't like they were crusaders for the children. They weren't against good stuff, but they weren't crusaders. And what Welcome was trying to say, there's a coming crisis. These white people could be crazy, and we have to create an alternative pole. So what we did in Welcome, we organized bridge walks, because that was the symbol of division. First we had 1,000 people, but then they didn't have desegregation. Then we had 2,500 people on the Sunday before the phase 1 of desegregation. We also organized neighborhood committees, but also at every school, where it began in John F. Kennedy, where my mother-in-law went with CJ and held a welcome sign to welcome the kids when they got off the bus. And what we were able to accomplish, at least at the beginning, was no violence. And in fact, on the second bridge walk, it was like the anti-busing people had been organized by Michael Charney. Meaning, I said, maybe they'll just go to try to impeach the judge, which was totally irrelevant and wouldn't happen, but there were 80. There were like 80 anti-busing people compared to 2,500 people with signs like, busing is communism, impeach the judge. And that day, at that time I lived on the near west side of Cleveland, when I walked out to go to the bridge walk, there was a swastika on my sidewalk. For whatever reason, I dismissed it. Today, I would not dismiss that and say there are some real crazies, but I thought it was just the sputtering aspects of irrelevancy. I think I might have been right then, but who knows? So we had successful bridge walks led by Bishop Hickey, who was the bishop of all the Catholics, and Lou Stokes. So we pulled together. He was for desegregation. He wasn't one of the people that said, whatever. And things went relatively peacefully. And then the school district got real worried. What are they going to do? They're not organized. So they came to me, literally me, and we set up welcome clubs in all the secondary schools. And the purpose of the welcome clubs was to ease the transition from a life of segregation to one of desegregation. And what came out of that is I pulled together the Welcome Leadership Institute, was to take all the activist kids who were involved in these welcome clubs to meet, to share their experiences. They produced a newspaper called The Unity Bridge that was distributed to literally thousands of kids through their teachers. So the kids wrote stuff and we passed it out and they discussed it. When I taught the history of the American Revolution, I wanted the students to understand the grassroots movement that arose in the face of British colonialism. So I would go into the class and take away all the rights of the kids. You can't sit where you want anymore. You can't do different things. And then I would leave the room and I would have the kids respond in 3 different ways, exactly like the colonists. There were those who said, we got to get rid of the king. There were those, as John Dickinson, who wrote for a farmer in Pennsylvania, who wanted an olive branch, a compromise. And then there were the loyalists. And in each class, after I came back, all the kids responded differently. Some of them just sat and listened to me. And then I remember one kid yelling out, "You're the king," to understand it. But in one class, all the kids had turned their desks around and defied me, as the teacher and everything. And out of that class came an understanding that they too should fight for their rights. And so they organized a rebellion against the administration because they wanted a different kind of dress code. They didn't want to be hit by a razor strap, which was, I guess, fairly common, and a variety of other things. So they talked to me about it, and I said, well, maybe you should, wear a armband or something. These are kids. These are 16 and 17 and 18-year-olds. I walk into school the next day after I had my discussion, and there was a sit-in in front of the administration. And so I had to make a big career decision. Remember, it was a different kind of political time. I came out of a different movement that doesn't really exist anymore. So I asked myself the question, well, the worst thing they can do is fire me. So I walked in front of the sit-in and I gave like a 3-minute talk. And I said, whatever you do, don't be violent. I was afraid these kids would. They're kids, They're violent every day, with their friends or whatever. Whatever you do, don't be violent. And remember, the violence in the school comes from the administration, not for the students. So later in the day, they exiled me to the superintendent's office. I kept my job and was transferred to the Adult Education Center and met a lot of teachers who were sympathetic. One who was actually an Alabama SNCC organizer at one point in their life. So that began a career that followed the decline demographically of the Cleveland schools, where periodically there'd be layoffs, there would be school closures. So I taught at a lot of different schools. When desegregation began, they had closed the Adult Education Center, which I taught 2 or 3 years. And from there, I had organized on May 17th, 1978, a celebration of the Brown versus Board of Education. And I got Arnold Pickney, the head of the NAACP, and the head of the Teachers Union, to come to a gathering, and that was right before Welcome was about to take off. So they knew me, had some trust, knew that Welcome wasn't going to force you into pro or anti-busing situations, and so that was interesting for me to move on. While I was at the Adult Education Center, I invented a whole new class. It was to read the book Roots. It was fascinating, to work with these adults. They were like 18 to whatever. some of whom I found fascinating. I asked, how come you didn't go finish high school? Well, in Mississippi, we weren't allowed. They had moved here, so I learned a lot. I think it operates on two levels. One is the success in stopping racist violence by the creation of this alternative called welcome. I think that, even though it didn't mean that there was racial harmony, and there's all sorts of other issues that flow with it. The other thing was I became an elected leader of the Cleveland Teachers Union. And through that, I and people around the country created something called social justice teacher unionism, which says, of course we support higher wages and protections from administration abuse, but that's not enough in this time. We have to have a union that connects to parents in the community and advocates for children, as well as making sure we have decent medical care. So it wasn't going against, it was expanding. And through that process, I co-edited 2 books. One is called Teacher Unions and Social Justice. The other one just came out 2 or 3 years ago. It was a collection of 60 articles from around the country under the theme Teacher Unions and Social Justice, Fighting for the Schools our children and communities deserve. And now there exists maybe 15 or 20, maybe more, teacher union locals who see themselves as leaders for social justice teacher unions. So the impact is pretty strong. Connect to the communities they serve. That could be by talking to ministers, talking to nonprofits, talking to Leah. Really, there should be a group, particularly maybe Black professors that can share their life experiences, not their academic research. So that's one thing. The second is, I think they should look at something I work now closely with, the Zinn Education Project, for massive teacher materials and Outlook, and now something that I developed, an annual Teach the Truth gathering. Figure out how they can get a cohort either in the district or in their school that has a supportive atmosphere for what they want to do. You can't do it alone. You can't transform society just by being a good teacher. You need to think of all the connections, how you inspire people. And the last thing, little happy, love your students. You can't be a great social justice teacher without having a deep commitment to the success of your students, and maybe you can inspire some of them. However, and here's a very precise suggestion, you're not going to be able to individually solve all the social problems that kids bring to the classroom. They are so enormous, and that's out of your ability. So think of what you can do, what you can handle, and have a group of people you can regularly talk to. And also, they could call me. I'll listen.